The IPCC is an organization that was founded by the UN and by the World Meteorological Organization to study climate change and to not do research, but to just summarize, as I showed you with these books, to summarize the research that's been done over a period of time. And another thing that's important to understand is that the IPCC, this monolithic organization that sometimes is the IPCC says, the IPCC is thousands, many hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteer scientists who come together spending, well, one report came out in 2007, this one came out in 2013. The time in between was spent preparing the second report. So they spend years meeting and combing through the literature on their spare time, because these are all people with full-time jobs doing other things, and they are dedicating their time to try to summarize as best as can be done the science of climate change. So this is an organization that is really important in that sense, but it's not a group that's doing its own research with an agenda. I often think about what this would be like, having, for one thing, now for 150 years, a science conspiracy about climate change that consists of people from Middle Eastern countries, China, Europe, South America, India, the US, all agreeing exactly on the conspiracy that has to be undertaken to promote this hoax of climate change, just to annoy the American political system. I mean, it's really, it would be pretty remarkable if they could pull it off, but I don't think that's what's going on. The other thing to notice is it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was formed in 1988. Climate change was already in the title. It wasn't global warming. The change from global warming to climate change was not part of a language battle because global warming wasn't happening, so we had to change the rules of engagement, as some would say. Climate change was always the point, because it's not just temperature rises, it's not just global warming, it's ocean acidification, it's glacier melt, it's sea level rise, it's sea ice melting, it's all these things, biodiversity changes, range changes for species and phenology. All these things fit together, and they're all part of the evidence that we have that climate is changing. It's not just one temperature record that seems to get the most prominent recognition. It's all this stuff as a package. And in science, what we do is we try to figure out what's the most compact, the easiest explanation for all the evidence we have. If it were just temperature rises, maybe we could figure out different explanations for that. But when you put this whole package together in 1,000 pages, really we understand it as Tyndall and Arrhenius and Fourier recognized a long time ago. One of the other things, and then I'm going to finish some of this, finish the IPCC piece. One of the other things is to realize I was able to work on an IPCC special report on renewable energy a few years ago. Drafts of the chapters are sent out. I forget what it was called, some sort of a lower level contributing author on a chapter. The drafts of these are sent out to governments who send it out to people like the EPA and others to make comments on the drafts. They send them back, and every single comment has to be replied to. This is not a secretive process, it's an open process. So on the third draft of the chapter I was working on, we had 900 comments that we had to answer, each one of us, and for those of us responsible for a given piece of it, we had to sign our name to the answer, to the reply we gave to that comment. So there's a spreadsheet somewhere that has all of this, and that's on the third draft of one chapter. Okay? So this is really a thoroughly vetted report. Of course, there's going to be things that people don't agree with or that are problematic, perhaps, but because you can't, if you've got 900 comments, you're obviously not going to satisfy everybody with their concern about every piece. Okay. The only other thing I'll say is that for the IPCC, people will say it's a political process. The summaries that get the most attention, because most people don't read 1,000 pages, they read the 40-page summary, if that, then They are political documents. They have to be approved in a plenary session, word for word, with unanimous consent by representatives of governments from around the world. All the member governments send their representatives to approve the summary for policymakers that is published after the reports are done. Now, the summary can't be inconsistent with what's in the reports, but it is supposed to be a summary, consensus summary of some 100 nations with people in the room arguing about every single word, and it has to be. That's going to be a political process, but it's certainly going to be the lowest common denominator. It's got to be a conservative summary of the report simply because of the way it works. And that's not usually the way it's presented in the mainstream media, however. Okay, so what are some of the most striking conclusions of this newest report? I'm just going to read a couple of quotes. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. The atmosphere and ocean have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, sea levels risen, and the concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased. Another quote, human influence on the climate system is clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. Recent climate changes have had widespread impacts on human and natural systems. Quote, anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have increased since the pre-industrial era, driven largely by economic and population growth, and are now higher than ever. This has led to atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxide that are unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. Human species has been around about 150 or 200,000. Their effects, together with those of other anthropogenic drivers, have been detected throughout the climate system and are extremely likely, that means in their language 95% likelihood, to have been the dominant cause of observed warming since the mid-20th century. In recent decades, changes in climate have caused impacts on natural and human systems on all continents and across the oceans. Impacts are due to observed climate change, irrespective of its cause, indicating the sensitivity of natural and human systems to changing climate. And finally, continued emission of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasing the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. Limiting climate change would require substantial and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which, together with adaptation, can limit climate change risks. So much for the lowest common denominator, most conservative statement of what's going on. It would be interesting to see what some scientists would say if they were asked to just give their gut feeling of what might happen. And we see that with James Hansen and Richard Alley and others who have been speaking out loudly about climate change.